Welcoming all of you to the last webinar in our Leadership Development Institute series for this year. And so the topic today is ensuring equity and diversity and inclusion in your programs and in your organization, which is a topic that's near and dear to both Paco and my hearts here at River Network. Let me make sure. Okay, Paco, are you seeing the second slide?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. So this has been the series. Like I said, today's is the last session. We do have recordings available to all of the previous sessions, so do reach out if you can't find those in your inbox, if you had registered and didn't get to see them, or you're not receiving some of the quarterly newsletters that we're sending out to our paid members with these links. Please reach out and let us know. Either Paco or I could share those with you. So one thing I want to highlight is that we have offered this webinar series before, Developing Effective Water Organizations. And for us, it really is about covering the basics of what it takes to be an effective organization that focuses on water issues. We have offered this institute before, but this is the first time that we're including the topic of equity, diversity, and inclusion in this webinar series. And by doing this, we really are highlighting that as River Network's own journey, and we'll share a lot about that, along the EDI, and I'm using EDI as shorthand for equity, diversity, and inclusion. As our own work has deepened in this area, it is becoming entirely too clear for us that this is really about the basics. Just like we're talking, building strong boards and increasing your fundraising capacity, unless you're keeping an eye on ensuring that your work is equitable and that you're thinking about how to do inclusive work, you don't have the basics covered. So it is a statement on part of River Network of the importance of developing and honing practices to make that we're ensuring equity through our work. So with that, I want to thank you for being members, paid members to River Network. I do want to remind you, and I'll do it again here in a minute at the end of this session, that one of the benefits is you receive 25% off registration for River Rally and access to scholarships, and tomorrow is the deadline to apply for a scholarship to attend Rally. That is integrated into the registration process. So please, if you're thinking of joining us, which we hope you are, in Cleveland in June this year, do note that it's best to get your registration in by tomorrow. And there are other discounts and funding opportunities that come with your paid membership. So thank you for being a member, and let me offer Carly's email down below if you have any questions about those benefits. So just really quickly, my name is Diana Toledo. I am the Leadership Development Director based out of North Carolina for River Network. I know a few of you out there in the rooms. I am joined today by Paco Yervides, who is our Leadership Development Manager based out of Ohio and focusing in the Great Lakes. So we both have a long history with River Network doing a lot of capacity building support. But I want to say front and center, we are not experts in this topic of equity, inclusion, and diversity. We are learning along the way, just like you are. And we have been two leaders within River Network pushing this forward for our own organization and then thinking about the implications for the larger network. So we have learned a lot from other entities that are doing this work on their own and alongside us. Some experts and some trainers and consultants that we've been able to engage along the way. So today we really just want to share River Network's experience and what we've learned along the way, and really are approaching this as partners with you as you do your own work on equity, diversity, and inclusion. On the right-hand side of your screen, you'll see some of what we're going to cover today, definitions and the why. Share River Network's own work along the way. I want to share a couple of useful frameworks for approaching work on equity, diversity, and inclusion, and tools and strategies that go with that. and then provide opportunities throughout the session to have some questions and some discussion. So really hoping that you'll jump in and participate in this session. So I'm going to launch, and there's a lot to say before we pull up that poll. There's a lot to say about how we can foster equity, diversity, and inclusion in our work. We're going to cover a lot of territory today, and my goal really is to leave you with some ideas for next steps that you can take within your own organization, and a couple of frameworks that I hope you'll find helpful in organizing your thinking, in helping you prioritize what are those next steps for your own organization. And I just want to own up at the very front end here that one of the challenges in putting together this presentation is that I had to make some certain assumptions about where each of you in this webinar room is in relations to this topic. And so I want to just kind of point those out. One assumption is that you're coming into this discussion with an open mind about the work that's ahead to make progress on EDI, in a sense of curiosity about how your organization could do things maybe differently than you're doing today. I am assuming that however each of you define the reasons for why you want to do this work, all of us here agree that it is an important topic that we really cannot ignore in the world of water conservation. So those are my assumptions. Feel free to push back, but that's kind of where I'm coming in. So if that's inaccurate, it'll show up throughout the discussion, and I look forward to the conversation. So without going any further, let me go ahead and open up the first poll, Paco, if you would. I just want to see who all is in the room, sort of the role that you play within your organization. Paco, are you able to open that?
Yes, Diana, in your previous screen, it was showing one slide and then the next slide, kind of like the format. So while I collect this information of this poll in the second, maybe you could just play with the formatting of. That's what I was seeing. And
I'm not understanding that.
When you were showing your presentation, it was showing your main slide, but also the next slide that's coming over.
Ah, okay.
Okay, so we're asking what's your role in the organization, and people are selecting. We have 62% of the people voted. 80% are now program staff, 20% executive directors. We have 77% people voting. We, by the way, have 13 attendees, 12 of which are female, and one is Tony. Hi, Tony from Wisconsin. So thank you. I'm gonna close this poll in a second. 85% voted.
I'm sorry, can you say those numbers again, Paco?
Yes, as soon as I close it, it's gonna show the results. 73% program staff, 27% executive directors,
Great.
No board members, and no volunteers.
Great, great. All right, if you go ahead and close that one.
There's the answers.
Great. If you could open the second poll then. And so our question to you is, does your organization currently have some sort of work group or committee that is focused on equity, diversity, inclusion, or any one aspect of those three?
We're getting a few votes in. 62, 69% people voted. It is looking pretty even. No, actually, it's leaning more towards no right now. 85% of people voting. I will close in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Okay, and so what do we have there in terms of the numbers? Can you?
45% no.
Okay.
27% yes, and 27% not sure.
Okay. Okay. Great. All right. So hopefully there'll be some ideas coming out of today's session that you may decide you do want to create a group that is focused on this and sort of leading on those efforts. So that would be great. Paco, can you see my slides okay now?
No. I went, it looks as like poll number 1, so I think you have to reshare.
Okay.
There. Yes, now important definitions.
Okay, I apologize for these glitches. I don't know what's happening. Okay, so let's take some time to look at these definitions, which just want to make sure that we're all on the same page when we use these words. So, and I'll be using them throughout today's session. So diversity, the way, and these definitions come from a group that we've worked with, Avarna Group. And we do have 2 recorded webinars on the topic of EDI that are on our website. I'll share the links at the end, but they go in a lot more depth into the definitions. So I'm going to go quickly through these. So diversity being differences between us based on which we may experience advantages or encounter barriers in access to opportunities or resources. So we're not talking about diversity in the sense that we're all individuals and we're all unique human beings, but really thinking about some of the power dynamics that come with different. And that sometimes they incur advantages or barriers are incurred by people according to some sense of who they are and their identities, whether it's race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, etc. So really focusing on those power dynamics. Inclusion, we define as celebrating, valuing, and amplifying perspectives, voices, styles, values, and identities that have been marginalized. And so one thing to highlight here is that we're not just talking about welcoming differences generally, but again, we want to address some of the power dynamics within this. So we're not talking about tolerating, we're not talking about accommodating, putting up with others, or promoting that there's, and when we talk about accommodating differences, so one of the implications of that is that there is the norm of how things are done, and anything outside of the norm is accommodated. Rather, we're talking about lifting up and celebrating those differences, so that it honors those differences rather than accommodate. And then equity and justice. Equity is an approach to ensuring that everyone has access to the same resources or opportunities, such as in this case, for our work, clean water, access to recreational opportunities on water, clean drinking water, affordable drinking water, etc. Equity recognizes those power dynamics, that advantages and barriers exist, and that we don't all start from the same place. So again, the definition of equity is infused in a recognition that not all are created equal, and that our society confers advantages and barriers to individuals based on who they are and where they come from. And then finally, justice is the outcome of equity efforts. One of the challenges, as more and more of us have turned our attention to equity, inclusion, and diversity, is that we throw these terms around almost haphazardly. But it's really important that we keep some of these, that we ground ourselves in these definitions and recognize the distinctions between these 3 words. And then finally, cultural competence is the ability to interact across various dimensions of diversity and to flex with difference. So it's the effective interaction with people who are different than yourselves. And so one of the underlying assumptions in this term cultural competence is that it's not simply learning about other cultures and other cultural norms, but it's your ability to interact effectively with people who are different, because you're also recognizing how your own identity, how your own culture plays into those interactions. So it reflects a real self-awareness. So I'm going to go ahead and keep us moving. one important distinction here, and many of us have seen this image before, is not equality. If you look at the three scenarios that are presented here with the three kids trying to watch the baseball game, on the left-hand side, you have equality, which is giving everybody the same thing. They all have the same, box to stand on, regardless, and ignoring the advantages and the barriers that some of these individuals are experiencing just by their sheer height. In the middle, we have equity, which is ensuring that everyone has equal access to watching the baseball game. And so, you are providing opportunities, recognizing that they're not all, they bring different things to the table, right? So you're removing those barriers. And so justice on the right-hand side is really, just like taking out the fence entirely. So we talk about when you're doing equitable work, eventually the goal is to get to justice, so that you are aiming to remove the barriers. You're dismantling those systemic barriers that limit opportunities to what is in this case, watching the game. So if we lead with equity, the justice is the eventual outcome that we're working for. So I want to, if you have any questions about these topics, go ahead and start posting them to these definitions, go ahead and post them to the chat box. One last thing I want to leave you with here on definitions is that because we do use these terms around, to throw them around almost interchangeably, and they're quite different. Diversity is, is what we are, is who we are. Inclusion is what we do. We are inclusive of people who are, diverse. And equity is how we go about doing that work. So very distinct terms. Diversity is what we are, inclusion, what we do, equity, how we do it. And cultural competence is what we need in order to do it well, so that we get to the outcome, which is justice,
And if folks can't type into the question box, into the chat box, they can use the question box too. Margot just sent us a comment, which I completed. There's two persons by her computer. So thank you, Margot, for clarifying. Please feel free to use the question box also.
Okay. So with these definitions sort of grounding us, let's go right into the why. So why are you here is my question to you. And let me encourage you to use the chat box to answer, why is equity, diversity, and inclusion important to you, to your organization? Take a minute to think about that, and please share your answer in that chat box.
Or the question box. We have a few coming in. Can you read them, Diana, or you want me to read them?
Yes, I can.
Okay.
All right. We just have one question, one response coming in. I encourage everybody to share your why. Okay, so we've got critical to achieving our mission. It's great. I'm having trouble seeing some of these, Paco. If you can see them easier, if you could read them out, that would be very helpful for me.
Sure. Critical to achieving our mission, projected bias on people who some may think come from a certain background based on skin tone and surname, creates a barrier to equity and differences that may not have existed before. I work in low-income neighborhoods. We're all in this together.
Mm-hmm.
We predominantly work in small rural communities and want to ensure that everyone has a voice, especially those not traditionally represented in the communities. We are trying to change the culture of a region, which means everyone.
Mm-hmm. Great. Okay. So I'm hearing in there, we're all in this together. This is part of the work and mission critical for us. These are the communities that we are working with, low income communities, etc. So that's great. A lot of you are seeing this this work as really just critical to your mission, which is fantastic. Defining for yourself why this is important is really key. So this is why I'm starting here. And so being able to answer, for yourselves as an organization, and that means across the board and staff, this question of why it's important is really critical, because the work is hard, and knowing what is your guiding principle for this work is really key to keep going back to it. So articulating all of the reasons why the work is important, why it speaks to every one of your stakeholders, is really going to be key to making some progress on this path. So if we wanted to distill some of the reasons why EDI is important, as many of you said, it's important to your organization.
And one last one came in, Diana. EDI is critical to the growth of our organization as the culture of our region becomes more diverse. So definitely the trend in the United States, it is for less and less minorities and becoming more majorities.
Great, yeah. As the demographics of our whole country, in particular regions, change, to remain relevant, we really do need to be more reflective of who is in our communities. So if we can think about all the different ways in which it's important to organizations. I mean, there's tons of studies out there that show that having a diverse set of leaders, of participants in a discussion, allows organizations and entities to just perform better, to make better decisions for their future. Obviously, from an NGO perspective, this shouldn't be a driving factor, but the funding community is increasingly interested in supporting organizations that are diverse, and so especially along the lines of race and ethnicity. So it does more and more. We're seeing foundations, when you propose, put in a grant proposal asking what is the racial ethnic makeup of your board, etc. There are liability concerns, which again, this also shouldn't be a driver, but it is something to consider for your organization if you don't reflect your community and really have a diverse set of volunteers and leaders. But certainly at the last one here, it does make for happier staff and volunteers. And we're seeing more and more in the younger generations an expectation that they are going to have the opportunity to work in an organization that has an inclusive culture and a diverse set of leaders. And we're definitely seeing that a generational shift with those expectations. So there's something to be said for just having happier staff and volunteers that comes with an inclusive culture and a diverse set of staff. Why EDI is important to people, especially for those of us who are working in the water realm. Doing equitable work has implications for health and wellness. Everybody should have access to healthy waterways and healthy drinking water. This is just crucial to our well-being. And so unless we're being led and guided by EDI goals, we're really cutting ourselves short in terms of that. It's important for thriving communities because drinking water and clean, surface water, groundwater are just part of a healthy community and a healthy economy for the community. For equitable access to public waters, it's important for recognizing the many ways that humans connect with nature based on their culture and their history. culture and history drives how we connect with nature in many ways. And so providing everybody an opportunity to create those connections through the work that we're doing is really an imperative. And finally, to address disproportionate impacts of threats related to water that are felt and experienced by low-income communities and communities of color. Unless we recognize that indeed there are disproportionate negative impacts, and sometimes the benefits of restoration and cleanup efforts are disproportionately benefiting already communities that have a history of hoarding benefits, if you will. We can't do that without really having looking at our work through a lens of equity. We're never going to make progress on impacting some of these realities of our society. So that's another set of issues. And then finally, for the future of conservation, simply for the survival of a conservation movement, we need to engage, this is what some of you were saying with changing demographics in our community. Unless we engage this diverse youth of today, we're not going to cultivate the next generation of advocates. And really considering that protecting our rivers and our waters is a shared right and a shared responsibility. It behooves us to think about how we're providing ample opportunities for people to engage in our work so that they can step up into those responsibilities themselves. So those are just three general categories when we think about why is this work important. That is really important, is really useful to tease out in a conversation internally. Many times we see organizations coming to this topic of equity, diversity, and inclusion through a narrow set of ideas about how to do this. Oftentimes it's because it's rooted in one of these three areas. Is because it's important for our organization because, say, we have the Latino community is really growing in our watershed, and so we need to engage more Latino voices. That is a perfectly good reason to do this work, and I would encourage you to keep thinking more deeply about all of the reasons why this is important, and to start putting that into some sort of framing for the equity, inclusion, and diversity work of your organization. And so that's what I want to shift to here, is talk a little bit about EDI at River Network, and share a little bit about our own experience with this work. For us, River Network, our work on equity, diversity, and inclusion really, it goes way back. We have long history building on our role, serving as a fiscal agent I think in the mid-90s of the Indigenous Waters Network. So there was a strong tribal and Native peoples presence at River Network. Then I almost said at the turn of the century, I guess it was at the turn of the century, we started to focus more on urban water. So that also brought us into a work that touches with a lot of environmental justice organizations, a lot of community development organizations that are not necessarily water focused, but are working in that urban space. And so building on that history, in the last 5 years, our work really began in earnest. And it was spurred in part by a couple of board members who were very strong vocal leaders about the need for River Network to be more intentional about our EDI work, and provided strong leadership, really pushing us in this direction. So one of the first steps that we took in doing that work is just started to have some of those internal conversations at the board level, primarily, also at the staff level, to really articulate our commitment to equity, diversity, and inclusion. And so what you have in front of you is that articulation. It is available on our website. And there's a couple of things to highlight here. One is, in doing this thinking for us, it's really driven by the foundational belief that all people have a right to clean and ample water. And we recognize that there are biases and disparities that disproportionately burden communities of color, indigenous communities, low-income communities, with legacies of environmental damage and ongoing harm. And so for us, from the very beginning, the power dynamics is infusing all of our work, and this understanding that we too play a role in ensuring that everybody have a right and be able to exercise that right to clean and ample water. And we can be part of that conversation. We can be a partner in that transformation for our network and in our movement. So for us, this really was the very foundation on which everything else that came later was built. So we started with this commitment. I would, we'll come to this question, but if your organization hasn't done this work of putting this pen to paper and exploring and writing down all the reasons why this is important to you and how you're committed to it, that would be the first discussion. And so we can build on some of the things we were just talking about all the reasons why this is important. So once we did that, we moved along for a year or two and started to make our intentions more visible within the larger network. We started to collect data about the diversity of staff and boards within the groups in our network. And so it started becoming a lot more visible outside of River Network. And we started to get a little bit of pushback. Some groups within our network started raising questions about whether or not this was mission creep for River Network. And so we found ourselves really needing to ask the question, why? Why is this important? And so what we put together here was what we call our case statement, describing why equity, diversity, and inclusion is the foundation to our mission. So it is mission-centric for us. Some of the highlights that you would see here, and this is also available on our website, is, we talk about the shared need for clean, accessible, affordable water binds us all together. We talk about the fact that we need a larger, more inclusive community so that we can, A, be more powerful, B, put together and explore and identify sustainable and equitable solutions, and talk about the need to foster leadership in our next generation, et cetera. So some of the things that you saw earlier are really emerged pretty clearly in this case statement. And I tell you, we thought we were good with this and we could get down to work, and yet then the question of, so how are we actually going to do this? What does this look like for River Network? And so we developed another piece that for us is really part of our guiding light. And those are our principles for doing equitable, inclusive work. And so, I encourage you to take a look at those. We'll definitely share the links as part of the follow-up. But we really developed a set of, I think it's 10 principles. We value and try to balance human and ecological needs as one of them. We learn and share our learning is another one. So really thinking about it from our perspective as a network and an organization that has a lot of members of the network, and in a sense, our learning is very visible to our network. A number of our principles talk about that role, both as a leader and as somebody who is humbly learning along with others who are further along this journey than we are. So for us, that really was, that really has been key, those three pieces of articulating our commitment. And again, for us, that was at the very beginning, and without it, and it was a little bit frustrating for some of us who wanted to get right to action, to have to spend all this time developing this language. But what it is not just the language that's on paper, but it is the process of coming to agreement within our staff and our board about all of these issues related to equity and diversity. That was super helpful. And so now with that foundation, we're able to move together as one, and able to answer the questions that oftentimes emerge from members of our network about why we do this work. So with that, let me ask Paco if he could pull up this other poll, and would love to get a sense of whether or not your organization has begun to do this work. Have you articulated your commitment to equity, diversity, and inclusion in some way? Whether it shows up on your website, it shows up in internal strategic plans. Where are you on this process?
We have 80% of the votes coming in. Pretty interesting. I'll give it 5 more seconds.
If your answer is it's complicated, then I encourage you to, in the question chat box, go ahead and describe a little bit further what that means to you.
Yeah, we do have 14% saying it's complicated. 43% yes, 29% no, 14 not sure, and 14 it's complicated.
Great. Okay. If your answer is no, or you're not sure, I would encourage you to start here. And so that is facilitating the internal conversations to get to some agreement of why this is important, and to what extent you're committed to it, and what does that mean exactly. For those of you who have already done that, then you're ready to, I think, jump to the next area of the work. So, great.
I assumed one of the, it's complicated, then followed up through the question box. We actually have, with others, created a community conservation network, all working on this together.
Ah, perfect. Great.
And then one more says, I answered not sure, because we have talked about it internally, but haven't developed anything that is shared with the public. And this is going to lead to your internal and external frameworks.
So a couple of thoughts on that. We are in a similar place as that first person who answered. We're working with it as a network. We struggled with that. Are we doing this work as a network, or are we doing this work as our own organization? Where we landed with that is, let's first focus on getting our own shop in order, and then think about and encourage others in the network to do the same, and maybe move forward jointly. So that's how we answer that question. And the last comment I would just say is, for a long time, I don't know if it's for lack of courage, or because we felt like we needed to get this right to be really credible, a lot of this work was happening behind closed doors at River Network. And it was, I think it was 2 or 3 years ago, we hosted a small group of folks to think through this stuff with us, some of the leaders in the network at River Rally. And we heard loud and clear, like, get out there, talk about this work. It's not perfect. Acknowledge that it isn't, and learn in public. Because it looks like you're not doing anything. And so that really, that really spoke to us. And since then, we have been a lot more, well, here I am doing a webinar on our experience. So there is something to be said for, if you're doing the work internally, get out there and do it externally as well, and see if there's some value to that. So, okay, so there's a lot of ways to approach this work. Whether you're talking about how to incorporate equity into your programs, whether you're thinking about needing to hire more, people of color, more Latinos, more young people, whatever that might be, or thinking about your internal culture and how you go about doing the work. There's so many ideas and so much work to be done that it's really hard to know where to begin. And oftentimes what happens, like, we get called in a lot of groups that just want to figure out how they can get more diverse pool of candidates for their board. And that's where they're focusing. But sometimes those strategies, if pursued alone, can be really disjointed. And so working not just on one side of the coin here, that say diversity, isn't necessarily going to help you get to more equitable outcomes on the water side and addressing some of those disproportionate impacts that might be felt by some members of your community. So really, I want to now turn to a couple of frameworks that can be really helpful to map out, to organize, and to prioritize the different strategies that you might want to pursue along the EDI continuum. So this first one, I'm going to spend a good bit of time on this one, is we're borrowing it from Berthoud Consulting. I have an article. Actually, if you look at that chat box, you'll see an area where there are handouts. And I have gone ahead and uploaded a number of handouts to this webinar room, so you can go ahead and, while we're still here, open them up even on the different browsers so you can come back to them. I'll also share them via email after the webinar. So there's a long article that goes along with this. This is a super useful framework, and you know, it acknowledges that organizations are really complicated entities. And so it's not surprising that the diversity and inclusion work that we need to do is also complex. And so this framework represents several dimensions of an organization and makes different connections to the EDI work. So first, the attention here, if you look along the left to right, the x-axis, there's the external focus and there's the internal focus. So this is a distinction about how organizations and individuals interact externally with groups and entities outside of themselves, and internally, what's happening behind the closed doors. So that's the left to right axis. And then on the vertical axis, you can see how you know, there's an organizational focus and then there's the individual focus. So you can look at the individual players, the board members, the staff, and then on the top of it, on the top of the frame is the organizational perspective, right? So you have 4 quadrants. Quadrant 1 on the top right is how organizations interact and work with the community externally, so the external relations. As you move to the left, you have the internal culture of the organization, so looking at the internal workings of an organization. Then as you move to the bottom left, the third quadrant, we're looking at the individuals, focusing internally. So it's a certain self-awareness of the differences, our own biases, our own preferences, and sort of what we bring to this work and to the table as individual leaders within our organizations. And then on the right-hand side is how individuals, the fourth quadrant, how individuals engage and work with people of different backgrounds, so externally focused. When you start to look at these 4 quadrants, that's where you can start to provide some organization of how you can make progress across those 4 quadrants, which are all important. And it helps you provide a framework to start to prioritize those. So you might decide that, yes, you know, we really need to focus on the first quadrant. Our work needs to be look different. We need to work differently with the community. We need to work with new partners within the community. And yet, you might decide that it's very difficult for us to do that unless, you know, if we have individuals who are completely lacking in awareness of how to work with others that are different than themselves, or they're bringing a lot of deeply held biases that are getting in the way of the work, that starts to point to work that you might need to do across the 4th or the 3rd quadrant. So it's a way to sort of keep this work organized. In the middle, what we have is another important facet to consider, and it is how the organization learns from any of these quadrants. Whatever you're learning, how does that then extend to the other quadrants? At the core of any organizational change effort, and that is indeed what we're talking about, is changing the way we're doing the work, is the need for an organization to be able to learn and learn collectively, so that the whole organization is really increasing its understanding and its skills, in this case related to EDI. So we'll talk a little bit about that continual learning piece as well. So I'm going to spend the next 20 minutes kind of focusing on various quadrants here, because I have found that this provides a really helpful framing to think about what is the work and what are some strategies to make some progress on each of these. So I encourage you, as we're doing that, I'll pause for questions along the way, but please feel free to post them into the chat box. So let's start with the first quadrant. Top right, external relations. So the work here is examining your externally facing work. What is the organization doing and how is it doing it out in the community? And thinking about whether or how equity and inclusion are reflected in that work. So you think about the services, your water quality monitoring programs, your community outreach programs, the coalitions that you're part of, and how, who is part of those coalitions, how you're working together. This is all in this quadrant. How can you best serve your whole community and attract the various pockets in your community that are of interest for you to bring into the work? And so as we think about strategies for strengthening work in this quadrant, I'm including a number of them here. Building and maintaining mutually beneficial partnerships. As you think about partnering with other entities to approach that work in a way that there is value for both entities. And so some of you mentioned working with low-income communities. So whoever you're working with, whether it's individuals or community organizations based in those neighborhoods or in those areas of the basin, what is it that you get out of that working relationship, and what is it that you provide and they receive? What's the service and the value that they get out of that relationship? And so really thinking about that as a complementary partnership that brings value to both players. And really thinking carefully about, are those really transformational relationships that are there for the long term, so that even when the grant runs out, you have some practices or processes in place to continue doing work with that entity? Or does that relationship basically end when the grant sunsets? So that's something that we're thinking a lot about at River Network, and being very intentional about recognizing the power dynamics that come that are at play when we are partnering with organizations that have smaller capacities, smaller budgets, etc. Using culturally competent communications, both messaging and images, and also stepping into intersectional spaces. For the past 2 years, River Network, we began to review our entire website because some of the critique we got is people would come to Rally, which is our big public, where everybody comes together, and realize that there was a very diverse and increasingly year after year more diverse set of participants. And yet when you were looking at our website, we looked very much like our roots. Our roots are as a white, middle class, upper middle class conservation organization. And so our website was not reflecting the changes that actually were happening at River Network. So thinking about the images and the messaging, thinking what that looks like on your social media is really important. And I'll talk a little bit about the intersectional work in a second. Committing to learning and to growing. So we're going to make mistakes, but if you're open and soliciting actively feedback, welcoming it as a gift, so that we can learn from one experience and do better the next time, is really key. One piece that I'll share on that for River Network, we experienced this firsthand. at River Rally last year. I think it was just last year in California. We got some feedback and a very public critique due to the location where we were hosting River Rally. It was in what I knew as Olympic Valley, but it has a historical name that is a word that's offensive to Native peoples. And so we were called out very publicly. And I was very proud when our board very publicly acknowledged our grave mistake, apologized to all participants, in particular Native people who were with us, and are striving to be a lot more intentional and aware in selecting future rally sites. So this understanding that sometimes you just don't get it right, and you know, just with humility, learn publicly goes a long way to improving this work in the external relations. And then looking at all of your work through the lens of equity, we have developed a tool. It is for our internal use, but we're sharing it broadly, and we'll share it with you. It's uploaded as a handout. An equity tool that asks a number of questions that we think about as we put together new programs, significant funding proposals, to make sure that we have equity front and center as we approach our work. So here what you see is on the left-hand side, part of our web redo is highlighting and lifting up the leadership by people of color in our network. And so you'll see that as we add more member profiles on the network page, you just see a much more diverse set of water leaders represented in our work. Top right hand, you see some of our social media postings where we're also stepping into other spaces that are on issues important to our community. And so trying to also just be really representative of the wider world that cares about water and how we put ourselves out through our social media channels. And then on the bottom right, we have a picture of a meeting that we just had a couple of weeks ago in Milwaukee. So a lot of how we do our work is through cohorts, you know, working with a small number of organizations on a particular issue. And so anymore, as we approach cohort work, right now we're working with these 7 communities that are represented here on drinking water safety issues. And we make sure that we pass off significant amount of funding with not a lot of strings attached. So each of them got a $10,000 grant, and we cover all of their expenses to trainings, et cetera. And so thinking about bringing value to smaller capacity groups in this case. And now that that grant is coming to an end, thinking about how can we extend like free or highly subsidized memberships to these groups so that we stay engaged, even as that project per se comes to an end. So thinking about those transactional versus transformational relationships. Finally, here I have just a quick screenshot of our equity tool with all the questions that we ask. You know, who's positively or negatively affected by this issue? Whose voices are included and excluded? How can we shift those dynamics, et cetera? So they're just prompts to get us to think about how equity intersects with any issue that we get involved with. And so this has been also really helpful in just like pushing our thinking to ensure that our programs indeed reflect you know, are infused through the lens of equity, I guess. So let me keep moving and just ask, as you are doing this work, how are you bringing inclusion and equity into your external work, into that quadrant? Would love to hear any examples of how you are, whether it's through communications and messaging, through how you shape your programs, through how you approach your partnerships, any bits of wisdom that you can share about what that looks like. I welcome you to share those now. And Paco, I'll need your help tracking the conversations.
Yep. So far,
Okay.
nothing.
Okay, let me come back to this. Please do, if you've got some, share them here.
Hired a community engagement coordinator.
Great. So you've got somebody on the ground, I'm assuming, in that community that you're trying to reach out to. And I guess a question I would have is, are these folks hired from the community itself? What does that look like, right? To start building those relationships. That's great. It does require some staff capacity to do some of that on the ground work for sure. Okay, I'll see if others are coming in. Paco will be monitoring that, but let me keep moving to the second quadrant then. And this is the internal organizational culture, which is, reflects everything that falls into an internal culture, the systems, policies, the structures, and considers whether they support incorporating the skills, experiences, ways of interacting that a diverse team brings to the table. So the way this is reflected is if you are able to recruit, say, board members or staff that are people of color or represent a particular demographic that is a minority for your board or for your community, are you able to retain them? It's sometimes easier to recruit than it is to keep somebody engaged. And if that is the case, this is oftentimes the reason. The culture of the organization is not such that it really welcomes and integrates differences into the fold. This is reflected on who's making decisions in an organization, who's sitting at senior leadership positions. Are salaries and benefits equitably distributed? Is there transparency about what that looks like? Are there some communication styles that are valued or preferred over others? So, are some styles getting recognized and celebrated more than others, or some accomplishments are given more credit, more value than others? How is conflict addressed? All of these places are ones where inclusion/exclusion is oftentimes made visible. And so let's talk about that. This is an area where River Network, we're focusing quite a bit on right now. So this is where, evaluating your hiring and retention practices for any biases. So that includes recruitment, hiring, compensation, how evaluations are conducted, who gets promoted, who has access to mentoring and professional development. We, in the handouts, there's a really good guide on this from the U.S. Sustainability Directors Network that I encourage you to download. With a lot of practices for how to make sure you remove biases from your job descriptions, how do you get the word out for recruitment, etc. The next piece is just looking at your physical workspace, whether you have bathroom access that isn't gendered, or for people who have ability issues or limitations. Do you have physical spaces that accommodate that, etc. Making EDI training available to all staff, and having a shared learning as a staff. For us, last year was the first time that we required every single staff person to attend at least a half-day long training on some aspect of equity, inclusion, structural racism, whatever was available to them locally. And then thinking about how do we make sure that we continue the conversation as a staff, the learning that individuals are doing. Another strategy is developing what is oftentimes called an inclusive team charter. At River Network, we called it our compact, describing the behaviors and the values that you want to promote and adhere to as an organization. That is, putting that to writing, to paper, keeping that front and center, and really holding folks accountable when they step out of those behaviors, so that you're calling people in to make sure they're coming back to these, and that these are inclusive behaviors that you would be outlining. And so, kind of creating a culture that really articulates those, talks about those, and keeps yourselves accountable to those can be a really helpful tool for addressing the cultural issues. And then finally, well, let me talk a little bit further. So River Network, what we've just done is we just finally published and created salary bands for the different positions at River Network. It had been a little bit of a black box of what people's salaries were and what was the possibility for advancement within any given position. And so in an effort to bring transparency to that, we just created salary bands. And so everybody kind of knows where they are relative to others, and what are the opportunities for advancement. We have also done a lot of direct outreach to networks and leaders of color as we're hiring. Right now, we're hiring for a Mid-Atlantic Leadership Development Manager. If any of you know of a good candidate, please, you'll find the job posting on our website. But, I've been doing a lot of work, just like making sure we get to the networks of, Green Latinos or blackjobs.com or HBCUs, and promote our opportunities for work within different networks, and making sure that the language we include in all our job postings is removed our bias, and in our interview processes is, that we've addressed possible biases that can creep into that. So this last bullet here,
Diana?
Yeah.
On the first quadrant, there was one more that came in, going to where people are, or where people socialize versus waiting for them to come to us.
Absolutely. And that's part of creating those transformational relationships, right? It's making sure you're showing up to the meetings that those communities are hosting, and understanding the issues that are also priority to them, even if they fall outside of water. It's a great practice. Thank you.
And a clarification question from this last slide. You were talking about salary maps. Did you say salary maps?
I said salary bands, so that we've defined, so a manager, the range of salary for a manager is from such and such, to such and such in terms of dollars. Directors are going to make this amount. Associate levels, this amount. We have enough staff, even though it's actually relatively small, 14 people. We have a number of different categories of staffing. And so just providing clarity as to the salary ranges for each of the positions. That's the exercise we've just gone through. So finally, on the last bullet here, understanding dominant culture traits. There is an excellent handout here attached to this webinar room about dominant culture and being really intentional about those norms. So this is where the inclusive team charter can come into play. One word about that. So culture is really hard to define, and this picture does a good job of explaining why, because the longer you swim in a culture, the more invisible it becomes. In our society, the dominant culture that shapes our organizations, our institutions, and this impacts how we see each other, how we interact, that is a white middle class culture. And you'll see that culture reflected not just in white-led organizations, but also organizations that are led by people of color, because that is the culture we are swimming in. We tend not to notice it because it is all around us. And yet thinking about what are some of the dominant culture traits that are found, that are, white dominant, that are part of white dominant culture, can be really helpful, because we tend to default to those traits. And so unintentionally replicating that in our organizations without really examining whether or not those are the norms and the standards that we want to follow often becomes a challenge when we're bringing in people who are different, right? Who maybe haven't been raised or have different approaches, different ways of processing information, different ways of communicating that don't fall into those dominant culture norms. And so some examples of that you'll see in that handout is how we value the written word versus other ways of communicating, our focus on deliverables and things that we can measure, a sense of urgency that runs counter to really giving ample time to be inclusive, to process things carefully and slowly, a strive for perfectionism where mistakes really are seen as a personal thing, and there's less focus on learning as an organization and more on pinning the mistake to an individual, et cetera, et cetera. There's a whole lot out there. I encourage you to look at that document and to really think about to what extent does your organizational culture really reflect that dominant culture, and be intentional about what aspects of that culture you want to keep and which ones you want to be more flexible on, and make sure that those are then reflected in that inclusive team charter. Because this gets at the piece that is really hard to pinpoint, but you can see it played out at meetings, you can see it played out in email conversations of how these these things become a challenge when they're not directly addressed or considered. So I really encourage you to look at that. That is the work that River Network is doing right now, looking at dominant culture and how that plays itself out in our own organization. So without going further into that, let me just jump into the next quadrant to catch us up here. Quadrant 3 is self-awareness, the work being increasing your own awareness and understanding of your individual biases and how they show up, and your understanding of your privileges or systems of oppression that you have experienced. So this is in that internal individual quadrant. This really looks at your inner life, acknowledging and considering how your own personal beliefs, attitudes, and assumptions and behaviors impact how you work within, in this world. So, this really gets at understanding your own unconscious bias, preferences that you might have for working with people who are like you, more of an affinity bias, really digging into what stereotypes you might hold without even perhaps being aware of them, because this does impact the work. And so at an organizational level, how do you support individuals doing this work? The recommendations and strategies that we have on this line is really exposing yourself to diverse voices and perspectives, whether it's our board has hosted book clubs, there are podcasts out there, social media, books, lots of ways in which you can really expand the information you're taking in with incorporating different perspectives. Project Implicit is a great resource. It's actually, I think it's affiliated with Harvard in some way, and it provides an online set of exercises, if you will, to help you unearth your own hidden biases and learn how to mitigate and disrupt those. Participating in trainings to learn both history and experiences of marginalized communities. This is the requirement that we made for River Network staff, and really trying to help every staff person develop skills to analyze structural racism and understand systems of oppression, so that we can all be moving along our own personal learning journeys and bring that back to the work. Making space for others, lifting up the voices and perspectives, both in meetings, at community gatherings, through our websites, just really lifting up those perspectives that are not typically heard. And then finally, caucusing with your own affinity groups. If you're, cisgendered, heterosexual white woman, like finding that caucus and doing that work to process what you're learning and identify ways to keep yourself and your peers accountable, but doing that within your own affinity group, not leaning on people who are of a different identity to help you in that work. That is really work that each of us needs to be doing. So one tip I will leave you with, hang on Paco, is it's a very useful group norm that I have come across is the ouch, oops, and redo. When we think about disrupting our own biases and holding ourselves accountable, to create a culture, and I work with an organization that does this, we all agree to the ouch, oops, and redo. So that when you're participating in the discussion where something is said that reflects a bias, that makes you uncomfortable, you can simply say ouch. So that the person in a very easy way understands how their words are impacting others. You can also do an oops. So if you yourself find that you have said something or clarified a certain assumption that shows a hidden bias, give yourselves a chance to acknowledge that in a group, say oops, and do a redo. So like, how can we do this differently? How can I say that differently? So creating a culture where the oops and the ouch and the redo is part of how we work together can be super helpful in just like addressing those little, whether you call them microaggressions or little pinches that you can feel throughout the day in your interactions with others can be super, super helpful. Paco, did you have
some input? Actually, one of them said recognizing microaggressions, so you just went straight to that. Another one said from Norman Agustin, culture can be an asset, but it can never be an excuse. And finally, relegating people to demographics and stereotypes invalidates others' privileges and decreases participation and cooperation.
Mm-hmm.
So
Elena,
pretty good input. Yeah.
Thank you for those comments. Absolutely agree. I would be curious about this quote that you shared about culture. Culture can be an asset, but not an excuse. Yeah, we are responsible for doing our own learning and recognizing how our own culture in which we move is influences how we move through the world and interact with others. So that self-awareness really is a huge piece. And oftentimes it's in this quadrant is not where we think about doing the EDI work for our organizations. But really, the organization can only move as far as the individual leaders within it and players within it are moving. So that's why it's ignore at your own peril. Last quadrant. So this is how individuals interact with the external world. How do you relate to and work with individuals of different backgrounds? How do you communicate effectively across differences, build relations, resolve conflict, etc.? So again, we get to the disrupting bias when you observe it in individuals. And there's a number of ways in which we can do that. Certainly that oops, ouch, and redo as part of that. Asking questions, using humor, calling somebody in, but this is a lot easier if you have some sort of compact or group norms that provide a place for you to hang your hat on. So it basically gives you permission within your organization to take the courageous step to disrupt the bias in individuals or in your own organization. Because you have agreed as a group that there are certain behaviors that you adhere to and avoid, and so it really gives you something to lean on when you need to step out and actually call it out in an organization or individual. Using inclusive language and thinking about how whether it's misgendering individuals, inviting people to share how they want to be addressed or how they want to be described. Is it Hispanic? Is it Latino? Is it American Indian, Native American, Indigenous person? So if in doubt, just ask, but make sure that you are curious about what is the right language that makes people feel included and comfortable. And really, again, this shows up again, committing to learning and growing, soliciting feedback, welcoming it as a gift, even when it's critical and difficult to hear, to really think about trying not to go into a defensive mode, but learning as a result of that can be super helpful orientation to improving interactions with those who are of different backgrounds. So with that, just invite questions again or comments. And I'll keep us moving though. So the framework, again, you can't affect change by focusing on simply one quadrant. I encourage you to open up the handout, look at this framework, bring it back to your organization and engage in a conversation about what is priority for your organization. You know, what are actions you can take? Are there quadrants that are higher priority than others, actions that are higher priority than others in a given quadrant? And from there, identify what are some next steps for you to take. This, again, there's so much work and so many strategies that you can do that organizing them can be really the difference between making progress and not. And how you go about doing that, a strategy for this continuous learning, you know, is thinking about creating a change team. I think about 46% of you said on the front end that you had some sort of group or committee that had the overarching goal of providing some leadership and creating some momentum around DI initiatives. Let me just briefly say, at River Network, we started with a board committee on EDI. First, it was a working group, then it became a standing committee. There is staff representation in that. We also have another group, which is a group that has volunteer leaders that have helped us think through how to make River Rally more inclusive. So that is a group that includes primarily folks outside of River Network staff and board, but members of the network. So for us, those are our change teams, and both of those have led significant initiatives to really keep making progress on our EDI journey. And I know Paco, if you can share a little bit, Paco's been part of a different change team for a regional coalition. Paco, if you want to talk briefly about that work.
Yeah. I'm part of the change team with River Network as a staff person, but I'm also in the Healing Our Waters Coalition. There's a committee that was created about almost 2 years ago now. It's called the Equity Advisory and Action Committee, and we meet about every 3 months, usually through video conferences, but at least twice a year in person. And we have dictated or given suggestions to the strategic planning, the conference presentations, and several other points of view of consideration for Healing Our Waters Coalition, which is 150 organizations. So we are about 20 individuals, and all of us are voluntary, and it's really been very, very eye-opening in terms of perspectives. And I know Land Trust Alliance also has their change team, and several groups in the Environmental Capacity Builders Network have expressed interest, and they do that.
Great, thank you. So yeah, whether it's an internal team or like the inclusion at Rally or Paco's experience bringing external folks into that team, basically the duties are to, you know, that would be the team that organizes bringing back, say, the diversity diamond framework back to your organization. So leading the process to become more equitable and inclusive, assessing where the organization is today, leading a visioning process with the organization of what would it look like if we were doing more equitable work, more diverse organization, more inclusive, and create a sense of urgency toward getting to that vision. And then from that, how do you get from where you are today to that vision that you create? Is really establishing very clear, meaningful goals and strategies for how you're going to get there, and keep things moving forward and integrating it across the whole program of the organization. So this is basically the task that change team would have. It's very hard to simply add this onto, if it's a new initiative, to simply add this onto an existing committee or an existing structure, because it can be seen as add-on work. So for us, I know that initially many of these discussions at River Network were happening within the EDI committee. And yet, as we have made more progress and really integrated this into our work, you'll see discussions around equity and inclusion in our program committee and our internal staff and our work planning process. It just pervades every aspect of our organization. But we didn't start there. We really started just with the guidance from that committee. So let me, I want to catch this up. Here's a different model. It is a fascinating, really expansive approach to doing diversity and inclusion work. It comes from the Global Diversity and Inclusion Benchmarks, the Center for Global Inclusion, and I have a link here at the end. This is another way of approaching the work. It looks, but it is a reshifting of sort of where the diversity diamond does it. It looks at internal aspects, external and foundational aspects of an organization, and thinking about what strategies do you want to deploy across those three elements. And then I'll talk about the middle piece there, bridging all three. So in the foundational, it's a lot about doing the EDI assessment we just talked about, developing a shared vision, putting together a plan with goals and benchmarks, creating your team, your commitment statements, your shared language. You know, how do you define the terms? You can either borrow from the Avarna definitions or define the terms as useful to your organization, and really making sure that there's both the leadership support at the board and staff level, and the commitment of resources. Even if you're doing this on the cheap, it takes time. And so there are resources and staff time, volunteer time that get dedicated to this. So this is really like the very foundational pieces. Then this model moves into the internal pieces, looking at the internal culture piece, the recruitment and hiring and education and training that gets provided for staff, communications pieces, and all of that interwoven with, you know, internal policies, internal practices, work plans, etc. And then finally, the external piece. So again, if this is easier to wrap your head around this, this model doesn't go as deeply into the work that individuals need to do. It really is focusing more on the organizational pieces, but it can be also really helpful framework to guide your EDI work. The piece that I really like about this model is that looks very carefully at this middle piece, which is how do you assess and track progress towards your goals, and making sure that your external communications reflects your commitment to EDI, and that you are holding yourselves accountable to your progress on equity, inclusion, and diversity through regular reporting, both internally and externally. And this is, for us, something that we have tried to do a good bit of work on, and a couple of tools that I'll share is we have started to collect demographic data on participants to rally or any training that we do. You know, there was a hesitancy, honestly, initially to collecting this information. Some on our board felt it was intrusive, but we landed on the side of, if we want to be more inclusive, if we want to attract, you know, more diverse leaders into our work, we've got to have a way of tracking that progress so we know whether or not what we're doing is making a difference. And so the data collection piece became key. And the other piece that we've developed is we have, as part of our strategic plan, defined a set of indicators related to equity, diversity, and inclusion. And we break them up across those three components. And this is information that we collect through the form, like I just shared, that demographic survey, and other ways. You know, we look at, for example, here on Become More Inclusive, percentages of articles, blog posts, River Voice articles, and other pieces that we promote that are focused on an issue related to equity, diversity, or inclusion. So this is where the revamp of our website, the voices we're lifting up. This last year, we were able to say almost half. That we were quite proud of that. 44% of the articles, and we've defined what we mean by an article, right? In a blog post, it's got to be on our website. It's produced by us, etc. So just actually tracking that and seeing how that compares and where those trends are over time. Diversity on our board, on our staff, finalists for staff and board vacancies. You see, we haven't made a whole lot of progress on staff diversity, and yet we have managed to, at least on board vacancies, a lot of the finalists that we've talked to were, represented a more diverse demographic. So defining for yourselves what those indicators are that you want to track and actually committing yourselves to that. We collect these and report on them on a quarterly basis internally, and we haven't reported out to our external community on all of these, but a number of these we definitely have. So for us, this is what the tracking looks like. So with that, this comes to the end of my presentation. I'm going to put up a slide here with a lot of resources that we have, and I encourage you to post questions in the last 5 minutes that we have. So here are the 2 links to the frameworks. The tools, I will, these are all live links that you'll see. Tomorrow you will receive an email. It'll have a copy of today's presentation, and it'll have a link. Well, no, tomorrow you'll receive an email from GoToWebinar. We'll have a link to the recording. In the next few days, once we push that recording up on YouTube, I'll send another email to all of you, including all of these links. So whether they're linked or attached, to make sure that you have access, like the equity tool, we don't have that on our website, for example. And then I would just encourage you to really continue to learn. Down here, we talked about books and podcasts. One that we have found really helpful, a few of us on our staff, is this Seeing White podcast. It's a series, I think like 8 or 10 sessions. It's produced out of North Carolina, University of North Carolina. It is absolutely fantastic. So if you want to think about white culture, what, how that plays into, the situations that we're living in our society today, it's a great primer on that. There's obviously a lot out there, but, if you want to start an internal conversation with staff and board, listening to a podcast and discussing it over lunch would be a fun way to do that. There's the link to the white culture piece. And finally, the links to the 2 webinars we did a couple of years ago, which go into a lot more information about definitions and biases and the history of conservation, etc. So really encourage you to look at those. Did any other questions come up? Okay, I see.
Yeah.
Project Bias is a good tool you've presented to groups. That's fantastic. Definitely a great tool to walk yourself through and understand your own biases better.
There was one earlier that said DEI is in our strategic plan, and we've been advised to start with our staff on core value development prior to forming a board committee and educating the board in the meantime about. And I responded, I think it's a good start, but getting the board on board will be much more productive in the short run.
So let me make sure. I have been advised to start with staff on core values development prior to forming a board committee and educating the board. Yeah, I don't know. I'll be honest. For us, we approached it as a shared exercise, board and staff together. And if you can find a couple of leaders on your board to bring into that, and it includes all staff or a couple of leaders on your staff, what you don't want to do is for staff or board to get ahead of the other. So I would encourage shared learning on this front. And it could be that there's a core group that really looks at core values development and does that hard work, and then another group that starts the shared learning through podcasts or book clubs, etc. But for us, it's been very helpful. Oftentimes what happens, and I've seen this working with organizations, staff is way ahead of the board, and then they're pulling along, and that can be a challenging time for an organization when the staff is ready to make faster progress. and is thinking about their work very differently than the board. So kind of walking that path together, I would say, is really key. So yeah, don't leave them behind.
And
We do have
I just
Paco.
posted the link to the
Yes.
survey in the chat box.
Yeah, Paco's going to upload that link. It will come in that email you'll get tomorrow, but please take a few minutes. It'll be 2 minutes, I promise, to fill out the evaluation. It'd be super helpful for us. Yeah, scholarships are due tomorrow. Please don't forget. If you hopefully we'll see a lot of you at Rally. There's a whole lot of sessions around equity and inclusion at Rally. I leave you here with this beautiful message that was shared with us by one of our keynote speakers at Rally, Chief Colleen Sisk, who's the spiritual leader and tribal chief of the Winnemen-Wintu tribe in Northern California. So there's good hard work ahead of us, but if we start down this path, I too believe that good things are coming. There's my phone number, there's my email. I invite you to reach out to me with any questions, or as you sit with all this information and think about how to bring it back to your own entities. It's something obviously Paco and I are both feel very passionate about, and we'd love to support you along the way. So with that, I think we're calling it a webinar. Thank you, everybody, for taking the time. Really appreciate your engagement, and look forward to further conversations on this. Have a great afternoon.